Welcome back to TokenTrends Weekly, everybody. I'm Max Ledge, and today we're joined by Sasha Coin.
Always a pleasure to be here.
We're diving into a topic that almost feels like it's straight out of science fiction, the U.S. Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. It sounds pretty intense.
It's definitely a headline grabber. The concept itself, though, it's not as out there as you might think.
Okay, so break it down for us. What exactly are we talking about here?
Imagine the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, right? The massive stash of oil the U.S. keeps for emergencies.
Right, makes sense.
Now swap the oil with Bitcoin, and that's basically what we're looking at, this reserve for Bitcoin.
So the U.S. is building a strategic reserve for Bitcoin.
That's exactly what's happening. It all started with an executive order that President Trump signed back on March 6, 2025. This order basically directs the government to create two things: the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve and the U.S. digital asset stockpile.
Okay, hold on. Two separate things. What's the difference between those?
Yeah, good question. So the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is specifically for Bitcoin. And the funding for that's going to come from, get this, forfeited Bitcoin.
Forfeited Bitcoin. Where's that coming from?
Seized in criminal and civil asset forfeiture proceedings, like think Silk Road, those kinds of operations.
So the government's been holding on to a pile of Bitcoin from, like, criminals and stuff this whole time.
Pretty much.
That's wild. How much are we even talking about here?
Over 200,000 Bitcoin. And at today's prices, that's a pretty significant chunk of change. And according to that executive order, they're holding on to it.
That's smart, considering they sold a bunch back in March 2023, and the price has basically quadrupled since then.
Yeah, that was definitely a missed opportunity.
Big time. Okay, so back to those two things. You said the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is for, well, Bitcoin.
Right.
What about that U.S. digital asset stockpile?
That one's a little different. It will include any other digital assets that the government already has. But they're not planning on buying any additional assets for this stockpile.
So it's more about managing and consolidating what they already have, not going out and buying more.
Gotcha. So why now? Why is the U.S. suddenly so interested in hoarding Bitcoin? What's the point of all of this?
There are a few potential benefits, and there's a really insightful CoinLedger article that we came across that kind of outlines these benefits. The first one is that this could really boost the value of government assets, especially with Bitcoin's history of price appreciation.
Because traditional investments haven't exactly been setting the world on fire, right?
Exactly. And that leads right into the second benefit: inflation protection. Bitcoin, unlike our traditional fiat currency, isn't subject to the whims of, central banks. So it's kind of a hedge during times of economic uncertainty.
So kind of like digital gold, right?
Exactly, digital gold. And that brings us to the third benefit. It strengthens the digital economy. By creating these reserves, the U.S. is signaling that they have confidence in Bitcoin and in the broader cryptocurrency market as a whole.
So it's like they're saying, hey, world, we're taking digital assets seriously now. Exactly. And the fourth benefit is diversifying government holdings. Right now, a significant portion of U.S. reserves are in those traditional assets, like gold. Adding Bitcoin into the mix adds a level of diversification and potentially reduces some risk.
So they're spreading their bets, which is always a good strategy no matter what you're doing.
Exactly.
But this whole idea of a country holding Bitcoin, it isn't exactly new, is it? Didn't El Salvador do something similar a few years back?
They did. Back in 2021, El Salvador became the first country to actually adopt Bitcoin as legal tender and a reserve asset.
Wow, and how's that been working out for them?
Estimates suggest that they've actually seen gains of over 127% on their Bitcoin holdings.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. So there's some real-world precedent for this working.
There is. They also saw a positive impact on remittances, people sending money back home. Bitcoin made it easier and cheaper to do that.
So there are some actual real-world benefits beyond just the potential profit. This is getting more interesting by the minute. But how is the U.S. planning to manage all of this Bitcoin? They can't just stuff it under a mattress somewhere.
That's where their proposed Bitcoin Act comes into play. It was introduced by Senator Loomis. And it's a pretty comprehensive piece of legislation that basically lays out this whole framework for acquiring, managing, and securing the strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Okay, I like it. Let's unpack this a little. What are some of the key elements we're talking about here?
Well, first of all, it proposes this 5-year Bitcoin purchase program. So the government would be authorized to buy up to 200,000 Bitcoin each year.
Okay.
With a total cap of 1 million Bitcoin.
So they're not just relying on those seized assets. They're actively going into the market as buyers.
Right.
That's a pretty big deal. Wouldn't that just send the price through the roof?
It's a valid concern, and the Bitcoin Act actually addresses that directly. The purchases would be made very transparently,
Okay.
carefully timed, and spread out,
Well,
all to kind of minimize the market disruption.
right, so as to not cause a huge price spike.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But where's all this money coming from?
Mhm.
Are taxpayers footing the bill for the government's Bitcoin shopping spree?
That's a good question. But
Okay.
actually, the Act outlines several funding sources that don't involve, using taxpayer money.
Okay.
So it suggests using things like treasury remittances, adjusting gold certificates, and even reducing the surplus funds that are held by those reserve banks.
So it's more about like reallocating existing funds, not necessarily creating new expenses.
Exactly.
Smart. But what happens to the Bitcoin once they buy it? Do they just sit on it forever?
Well, the Bitcoin Act mandates a 20-year minimum holding period for any Bitcoin that is acquired for the reserve.
Wow, 20 years. They're really in it for the long haul.
It's a long-term investment strategy for sure.
But we're talking about a lot of Bitcoin. Where are they going to keep it all safe? I mean, that's going to be a pretty big security concern.
Absolutely. Security is a huge priority, and the Act actually has a plan for that.
Okay.
It calls for these decentralized secure vaults
Okay.
that are going to be managed by the Treasury Department and spread out geographically across the U.S.
So no single point of failure.
Right. And they're keeping the locations pretty hush-hush
Okay.
for security purposes, obviously.
Sounds like they're taking security pretty
Lots
seriously.
of huge research.
That's reassuring. So we've got the government acquiring Bitcoin, holding it for the long term, and storing it securely. What does this all mean for the average Bitcoin investor? Like, why should I care?
Well, the U.S. government essentially giving Bitcoin this, stamp of approval is bound to have these ripple effects throughout the entire market.
I can imagine. It's basically the ultimate endorsement.
Right. And this kind of institutional adoption, it could lead to more demand from those, large investors.
Okay.
And that further solidifies Bitcoin's position as that digital gold.
And that's probably going to increase the price
Yeah.
if there's more demand.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility.
Okay.
It also has the potential to drive even further innovation and adoption as more businesses and individuals see that legitimacy that government involvement brings.
So it's like this chain reaction with the U.S. government kind of setting it all in motion.
Right.
But I'm sure not everybody is thrilled about this idea of a U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve. There are always critics.
Of course.
Yeah.
What are some of the concerns that they've raised?
Yeah, what are people saying?
Well, some people question whether Bitcoin is really as essential as a strategic asset, like petroleum, right?
Right.
Which is, crucial for things like national security and energy.
Right.
So they argue that Bitcoin's role in, critical infrastructure or disaster response, things like that, is still, largely untested.
Well, yeah, we've definitely seen how vital those oil reserves can be during, like, those big global crises.
Right.
But Bitcoin, that's a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of potential price manipulation. Some critics are worried that the government buying up all this Bitcoin could artificially inflate the price.
Right. And benefiting existing holders.
Exactly.
So it's kind of, there's concern that it could become kind of like a government-backed pump and dump scheme.
That's one way to put it, yeah. Transparency in how the government acquires Bitcoin is going to be crucial to address those concerns and maintain market integrity.
Makes sense.
And, of course, we can't forget about Bitcoin's, infamous volatility. I mean, it can swing wildly in price, which makes some people understandably nervous about how suitable it is as a long-term reserve asset.
Yeah, no, the volatility is a huge concern, especially for something as, like, important as a national reserve. Bitcoin has shown incredible growth potential, for sure.
Right.
But it's also had those dramatic drops. So the government's going to have to carefully manage that risk.
Absolutely.
It's definitely a balancing act.
Yeah.
So with all these different opinions and potential outcomes, where do we go from here?
Well, this is really just the beginning of a much larger conversation about the role of digital assets in the global financial system.
Yeah, it's like we're watching a financial thriller unfold, but in real time.
Absolutely.
The U.S. making this move into Bitcoin, it's sending shockwaves throughout the entire world. So how are other countries going to react to all of this? Are we going to see like a global race to accumulate Bitcoin?
That's the million-dollar question. Or maybe I should say The multi-trillion-dollar question. I mean, it's really hard to say for sure. But the U.S. establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve, it definitely adds legitimacy to this whole idea that digital assets have a place on the world stage.
Right.
So it could definitely encourage other countries to at least explore some similar strategies.
Right.
Potentially, that could lead to a shift away from those traditional reserve assets like gold.
So we might see this gradual, maybe not so gradual, move toward like a more digitally focused global economy. I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
It's definitely a possibility. And with a shift like that comes a whole bunch of other questions. How will this impact global trade? Will we see new digital currencies that are backed by governments? What role will decentralized finance play in this whole new world order? There are so many unknowns, but it's definitely a fascinating time to be following all of this.
Yeah, it feels like we're on the brink of something brand new, and the U.S. just took a really big leap forward. But let's bring it back down to earth for a second.
Okay.
What does this all mean for, the everyday investor, the folks who aren't necessarily trying to play on this global scale? What does it mean for them?
Well, that increased attention and legitimacy that comes with the government's involvement, it could attract more institutional investors to Bitcoin,
Right.
potentially driving up that demand and, as a result, the price.
So it could be good news for folks who are already holding Bitcoin.
It could be, yeah. But, it's important to remember that Bitcoin is still a relatively young asset. And it's volatile. There are definitely risks involved, and past performance, is never a guarantee of future returns.
Yeah, Bitcoin's not a magic money tree or anything like that. You always have to do your own research, understand the risks, and invest responsibly. But even with all that said, it's hard not to get excited about the possibilities here.
Right.
This strategic Bitcoin reserve, it could be a huge game changer, not just for the U.S., but for the entire financial world.
I think that's a great point to end on. I mean, we're really witnessing a historic shift in the way we think about money and value. The future is unfolding right in front of us, and it's going to be fascinating to see where this journey takes us.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the U.S. Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. It's a complex story, and it's changing so quickly. We'll definitely be keeping a close eye on it all as things continue to develop. Be sure to check back next week for another deep dive into the world of digital assets. And don't forget to subscribe to Token Trends Weekly so you don't miss a single episode. Until then, stay curious, keep learning, and as always, invest wisely.